Daf Yomi, Tractate Chullin, page 35a. Top of the page, we were talking about a stew that had spices of truma and the different levels of impurity that would be transferred, third degree or second degree, etc. And so that's where we left off yesterday. So the top of 35a says that Ula said, leave the matter aside of stew that has spices of truma in it. The less kazayas b'chdei achilas pras, as there is not an olive bulk, there's not an amount of an olive bulk of truma in the amount of stew. The spices that come from the truma spices are so little, so minimal, it doesn't affect of truma in the amount of stew that he eats in the time that it takes to eat a half a loaf of bread. Therefore, one need not treat the mixture with the level of purity that, required of truma. Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Amar Rabbi, ha'oichel shlishi shel truma atzma asul lechol mutar liga. Rabbi Yonatan says, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, for one who partakes of actual truma that is impure with third degree impurity, it is prohibited to partake of other truma, but it is permitted to come into contact with truma. V'yitzrich de'ula, v'yitzrich Rabbi Yonatan, im de'ula, havyamina, havyamina b'chulin, shinasu al teharas truma, aval truma v'negiya nami asur. Yitzrich Rabbi Yonatan, mid Rabbi Yonatan, havyamina, hanimina truma, aval b'chulin, v'chila nami shari tzrich. Okay, the Gemara notes that the statement of Ula was necessary and the statement of Rabbi Yonatan was necessary. As if the halacha will learn exclusively from the statement of Ula, I would say this statement applies with regard to non-secret food items that were prepared on the level of purity of truma. With regard to truma itself, perhaps contact is also prohibited. Therefore, the statement of Rabbi Yonatan was necessary. And if the halacha were learned exclusively from the statement of Rabbi Yonatan, I would say the statement applies with regard to truma. With regard to non-sacred food that was prepared with purity of truma, perhaps eating is also permitted. Therefore, both statements are necessary. Yes, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta, comment Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta was sitting before Rav Nachman, and he was sitting and saying that's something I often voice this question. There's a style. This is not the first time this has come up. There's a style of writing when the Gemara records a rabbi who says something. It says he was sitting and he was saying, and then there's a pause, and then it says and he was sitting and saying. Well, why the repeat? Why is that necessary? I'll read it again. He goes, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta was sitting before Rav Nachman, comma, and he was sitting and saying. Why? It doesn't always say that, but it says it enough to notice it. I've mentioned it in previous dafim, and I wonder why it does that. And it doesn't do it always. So is there something about the quality of these statements that make it stand out? Like the fact that it stresses that he was sitting and saying, is that a qualifier? You have to really be well versed in all the times where it says that. But okay. Anyway, he was sitting and saying, with regard to one who eats non-sacred food items that were prepared on the level of purity of sacrificial food, and these items have become impure with third degree impurity, he is ritually pure in terms of the right to partake of sacrificial food, as you have nothing that confers fourth degree impurity in sacrificial food other than consecrated sacrificial food alone. But non-sacred food prepared with the purity of sacrificial food does not. Halav kodesh mikodesh, who Rami bar Chama raises that objection from the Mishnah cited earlier in 33b. One who eats food with third degree impurity assumes second degree impurity vis-a-vis sacrificial food, and he does not assume second degree impurity vis-a-vis truma. Eating an item with third degree impurity is feasible only in the case of non-sacred items, as partaking of impure truma is prohibited. It is only possible in the case of non-sacred food items that were prepared as if their level of purity were on the level of the purity of truma. According to the statement of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta, why does this food assume second degree impurity? It is not sacrificial food which is sanctified. Amar le hanach l'truma she teharata tuma hi etzel hakodesh. Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak bar Marta said to him, leave truma alone. Its state of purity is impurity vis-a-vis sacrificial food. Therefore, non-sacrificial food that was prepared with the impurity, with the purity of truma, renders sacrificial food impure. Umena timra litnan bigdei am haaretz midras leperushin bigdei perushin midras lochlei truma bigdei ochlei truma midras lakodesh. The Gemara asks, and from where do you say that the purity of truma is impurity vis-a-vis sacrificial food? It is from a Mishnah in Chagiga 18b, as we learn the halachic status of the garments of an Am Haaretz, who does not scrupulously observe the halachot of ritual purity, is like that of items rendered impure by treading. For example, items designated for sitting or lying upon which a zav or a menstruating woman sits or lies, which are rendered a primary source of ritual impurity for individuals who scrupulously observe the halachot of ritual purity and eat their non-sacred food in a state of purity. In other words, it is considered a primary level of impurity for them. The halachic status of the garments of Perushin is like Perushin are like these who scrupulously observe the halachot of ritual purity. Okay, is like that of items. The garments of Perushin is like that of items rendered impure by treading for priests who partake of truma. In addition, the halachic status of the garments of priests who partake of truma is like that of items rendered impure by treading for those who eat sacrificial food. Amar Rava midrasos kamot shani midrasos. Rava said, "Are you saying that one can cite proof from the halacha of items rendered impure by treading that the state of purity of truma is impurity vis-a-vis sacrificial food? No proof may be cited from there, as the decree that the halachic status of the garments of priests who partake of truma is like that of items rendered impure by treading for those who eat sacrificial food is different." Okay, now 35b. Shema teisha v'reim ishtonida. Abba b'peri like amrina v'yisok b'peri nami amar. As with regard to garments, or at the top of 35b now, as with regard to garments, there is concern lest his wife sit upon them when she is impure with the impurity of a menstruating woman. But with regard to produce, we do not say that if it was prepared with the purity of truma, it renders sacrificial food impure. And Rabbi Yitzchak states this halacha with regard to produce as well. Okay, we'll stop here and continue on with the next Amud of Chullin 35b.